A millionaire brought his secretary instead of his wife to a major event. What she revealed as vengeance that night left everyone speechless. The skyline of New York stretched infinitely beyond the towering glass windows of Richard Thornton's penthouse, a glittering expanse of success and opportunity. The city was alive beneath him. Taxi lights weaved through crowded streets, distant sirens echoed between skyscrapers, and the faint murmur of millions of lives carried on in chaotic harmony. From this vantage point, Richard felt like a king surveying his empire, a silent observer of a world that he believed revolved around him. He took a slow sip of his scotch, the amber liquid burning just enough to remind him that he was very much in control. Inside, the atmosphere was one of quiet sophistication. Smooth jazz played from invisible speakers, the soft glow of recessed lighting casting a golden hue over carefully chosen artwork and sleek designer furniture. Everything in Richard's world was curated, every detail meticulously designed to reflect success. It had taken him years to build this life, and he wasn't about to let anything or anyone get in the way of his ambitions. Eleanor Thornton sat across the room, flipping through a thick business report, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was calm, composed, too composed. Her sharp eyes scanned the numbers with the same meticulous precision that had once made Richard admire her, back when he still believed they were a team. But lately, she felt more like an accessory to his success rather than a partner. She still dressed impeccably, still carried herself with the quiet grace of someone who understood the inner workings of the corporate world. But to Richard, she had become predictable. The steady buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts. He glanced down to see a message from Samantha Carter, his secretary. "Everything is set for tomorrow's meeting. They're expecting big things." Richard smirked. Samantha was sharp, ambitious, and understood the game in ways Eleanor never could. She had a way of getting inside people's heads, of knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. That was what he needed at his side. Someone who could push deals through, not someone who worried about the fine print and long-term risks. "Richard," Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm, drawing his attention reluctantly away from his phone. "I was reviewing the latest projections, and I have some thoughts. There are a few key areas that might need reconsideration before tomorrow's meeting." Richard sighed, already irritated. He didn't look up. "I've got it handled, Eleanor," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Let's not overcomplicate things. It's a straightforward deal." Eleanor paused, considering his words carefully. Her lips parted slightly, as if to argue, but she hesitated. She had learned over the years that there was no point in pushing when Richard was in one of his moods. She simply nodded. "All right, Richard, if you're sure." Richard barely noticed her response. His mind was already occupied with tomorrow's meeting. Samantha would be his secret weapon. A strategic move to impress the board and finally close the deal that had been months in the making. He was convinced that Eleanor wouldn't be able to handle the pressure, wouldn't have the sharp instincts to navigate the boardroom's politics. Later that evening, Eleanor moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, setting the table with the same care she did everything else in life. Richard leaned against the counter, watching her with an air of detached interest. "I've decided to take Samantha to the meeting tomorrow," he said casually, swirling the scotch in his glass. He watched her carefully, waiting for a reaction. Eleanor paused for the briefest moment, then resumed placing the silverware with practiced grace. "I see," she said, her tone unreadable. "If that's what you think is best." Richard frowned slightly. No protest, no attempt to convince him otherwise. He expected her to at least put up a fight, to remind him that she had been by his side since the beginning, that she knew the ins and outs of his business better than anyone. But instead, she simply smiled. A small, enigmatic smile that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "I hope it all goes well for you," she added, returning to her task with an eerie sense of calm. For a moment, Richard felt a flicker of doubt. Something about her reaction didn't sit right with him, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. Eleanor was always graceful under pressure, and perhaps she had finally come to terms with her place in his world. That night, as Richard sat in a high-end lounge with Samantha, discussing their strategy over expensive cocktails, Eleanor sat alone in the penthouse, gazing out at the city lights. The soft hum of the city filled the silence around her, But in her mind, there was no noise, only clarity. She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a name she hadn't called in a long time. A deep breath, a steadying pause, and then she pressed dial. "Hi," she said after a moment, her voice steady. "I think I'm ready to discuss that opportunity we talked about." The voice on the other end responded quickly, and as Eleanor listened, a slow, satisfied smile spread across her lips. Richard had always believed he was the only one making moves, but she had learned long ago that real power often lay in quiet preparation. Meanwhile, across town, Richard laughed at one of Samantha's jokes, completely unaware that his world was already beginning to shift in ways he couldn't yet see. He believed tomorrow's meeting would be the highlight of his career, but what he didn't realize was that Eleanor had already begun paving the way for something much bigger. Something that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about his business and about her. The next morning, Richard woke early, invigorated and confident, preparing for what he saw as the most significant meeting of his career. Samantha arrived promptly, dressed to impress, her sharp eyes glinting with ambition. They exchanged a few last-minute notes over breakfast, while Eleanor moved quietly around them, a ghost in the background. "Wish me luck," Richard said with a smirk, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. Eleanor simply smiled, her expression unreadable. "You won't need it," she said softly. Richard left without a second glance, his mind focused solely on his victory. But as the door clicked shut behind him, Eleanor picked up her tablet and smiled to herself. The game had only just begun. What would you do if you were in Eleanor's shoes? Would you quietly step aside or take matters into your own hands? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. Your support helps us bring more stories to life. The morning light crept through the towering glass windows of the penthouse, casting long, golden streaks across the minimalist decor. Eleanor sat at the breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from her, Richard was a whirlwind of motion, checking his phone, adjusting his tie, and skimming through the meeting agenda on his tablet. The scent of his cologne, expensive and overpowering, filled the room as he moved with the confidence of a man who believed he was in complete control. Eleanor watched him with quiet detachment. She had spent years standing by his side, offering counsel, support, and unwavering loyalty. Yet now, as he moved about the room, it was as if she had faded into the background, a forgotten fixture in his meticulously constructed life. "Make sure the team is aligned on the numbers, Sam," Richard spoke into his Bluetooth headset, pacing back and forth. "I don't want any surprises when we present." His voice was smooth, authoritative, every word calculated, every move intentional. Eleanor took a slow sip of her coffee. "I suppose I shouldn't wait up for you tonight," she said softly, breaking the silence between them. Richard glanced up, momentarily distracted from his conversation. "Yeah, it's going to be a late one," he replied absent-mindedly, his eyes already returning to his screen. "Big things are happening, Eleanor." "Big things," she echoed, her voice carrying an edge of something Richard didn't quite catch. He didn't have the time to notice the subtle shift in her tone, nor did he pay attention to the way she watched him, calm, composed, and yet different. Richard had made his decision. He had chosen Samantha. Eleanor knew at the moment he had dismissed her concerns, the moment he had brushed her off with that trademark wave of his hand. Samantha was the future, young, energetic, and willing to cater to his every ambition. Eleanor was just part of his past, a relic of the early struggles that no longer fit into his high-powered world. But Eleanor wasn't going to let him discard her so easily. She set down her cup and reached for her phone, scrolling through her messages until she found the number she had dialed the night before. Her fingers hovered for a moment before pressing the call button. "Good morning," she said when the line connected. "Yes, I've thought it over. Let's meet today. I believe we have something to discuss." There was a brief pause before the voice on the other end responded, and Eleanor nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "Yes, noon works perfectly." Meanwhile, Richard was already halfway out the door, his voice trailing behind him. "I'll see you later, Eleanor. Don't wait up." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. By noon, Eleanor found herself seated in a quiet corner of an upscale cafe, the kind of place she once frequented with Richard when they were young and hopeful, before success had turned him into a man she barely recognized. Across from her sat James Donovan, an influential investor she had met years ago through one of Richard's early ventures. He had always admired her strategic insights, something Richard had long since dismissed. "You sounded determined on the phone," James said, his keen blue eyes scanning her face. "What changed?" Eleanor stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Let's just say I've come to realize that certain opportunities don't wait forever," she replied smoothly. "And I'm not in the business of being left behind." James nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I always thought you had a sharper mind than most gave you credit for," he said with a knowing smile. "What are you proposing?" Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a neatly organized folder, one she had been working on quietly for months, tucked away beneath the stacks of Richard's business reports that he never bothered to read. "A better deal," she said simply, sliding it across the table. "One that Richard is too short-sighted to see." James picked up the folder, flipping through it with interest. As he read, Eleanor watched him carefully, her heart beating steadily in her chest. She had spent years shadowing Richard, observing his moves, learning his tactics, and now she was ready to make her own. After a long silence, James chuckled. "I have to admit, Eleanor, this is impressive. You're thinking bigger than I expected." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "I've had time to think." James leaned forward, his expression serious. "You know this puts you in direct competition with Richard." "I know," she said without hesitation. "But I'm ready for that." She wasn't sure if it was the years of being dismissed, the quiet accumulation of resentment, or the realization that she was capable of more than she had ever been allowed to show. But something had shifted within her. Richard might have chosen Samantha, but Eleanor had chosen herself. As the afternoon wore on, Richard was sitting in a lavish conference room downtown, Samantha by his side, effortlessly charming the board members with her carefully rehearsed talking points. He sat back, smugly satisfied with his choice, believing that he had finally surrounded himself with the right people. What he didn't know was that across town, Eleanor was setting the groundwork for something far greater, something that would change the landscape of his career forever. Hours later, when Richard returned home, exhausted but satisfied, he expected Eleanor to be there, waiting, as she always was. But tonight, the house felt different. There was no lingering scent of dinner, no soft hum of music in the background. Just silence. He frowned, loosening his tie as he wandered through the penthouse. "Eleanor?" he called out, but there was no answer. Instead, he found a single note on the counter, written in her precise handwriting. "Out for the evening. Don't wait up." Richard stared at the note, a strange feeling creeping up his spine. He had wanted space, after all, hadn't he? He glanced at his phone, but there were no messages from her, no missed calls. Just silence. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't regret, not yet, but something deeper, something unsettling. And as he stood there in the quiet emptiness of their home, he couldn't shake the feeling that, perhaps, Eleanor was slipping away in ways he hadn't anticipated. What he didn't know was that she wasn't slipping away. She was moving forward. Richard Thornton arrived at the glass-walled conference room of the prestigious financial firm, a confident smirk playing on his lips. He adjusted his navy blue suit, the fabric hugging his frame with the kind of perfection that only money could buy. Beside him, Samantha Carter walked briskly, her stiletto heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floors. She exuded the kind of ambition that Richard admired, sharp, focused, and completely devoid of sentimentality. "This is it," she murmured, flashing him a quick, reassuring smile. "Everything we've prepared is flawless." Richard nodded, his mind already racing through the numbers, the projections, and the carefully orchestrated talking points. The board members were tough, but he had no doubt Samantha's charm and his own expertise would seal the deal. This acquisition would cement his legacy, and Eleanor, well, she wouldn't even be a thought by the end of the day. Inside, the board members sat in a semicircle, their expressions unreadable, their eyes flickering with calculated interest. The room buzzed with a subdued tension, the kind that only major deals could create. Richard took his seat at the head of the long table, placing his hands confidently on the polished surface. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and commanding, "what we're offering today is nothing short of revolutionary. Our expansion plan is aggressive, our market positioning is solid, and with the right backing, we can dominate within the next quarter." Samantha stood and clicked through a sleek PowerPoint presentation, the screen illuminating the board members' faces with carefully curated financial projections and potential market dominance graphs. At first, the energy in the room was exactly what Richard had anticipated. Nods of approval, occasional murmurs of agreement. Samantha spoke with precision, delivering the pitch exactly as they had rehearsed. Richard leaned back, watching the board members absorb the information, feeling like the king he knew he was. But then, it started. A subtle shift. One of the senior board members, a man Richard had worked with for years, cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Thornton," he said, his voice measured but firm. "This all looks, well, impressive, but something feels off." Richard's brow furrowed slightly. "Off?" he repeated, keeping his tone light. "I'd be happy to clarify any concerns you might have." The man exchanged glances with his colleagues, and then another board member, a woman with a piercing gaze, chimed in. "Your proposal lacks depth and risk assessment. You're pushing expansion aggressively, but what happens if the market shifts unexpectedly? I see no contingency planning here." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Samantha beat him to it. "We've accounted for potential shifts with our flexible financing model," she said confidently, flipping to another slide. "We're positioned to pivot as necessary." The woman didn't look convinced. "That's not what I mean. You're focusing on growth, but what's the backup plan if growth stalls?" Richard felt a flicker of irritation, but he kept his expression composed. "Our strategy is aggressive because we believe in the market potential," he said smoothly. "Sometimes, bold moves are necessary." Another board member, an older gentleman with years of experience, tapped his pen against the table thoughtfully. "I assume you've consulted all your senior advisors on this?" Richard hesitated for a split second. "Of course," he lied effortlessly. "We've had input from my entire leadership team." The older man nodded slowly, but said nothing further. A heavy silence settled over the room, and Richard suddenly felt the weight of unspoken doubts pressing against him. Samantha pressed forward, filling the gaps with rehearsed confidence, but the energy had shifted. The questions became more pointed, the board members' expressions more skeptical. Richard could feel the deal slipping through his fingers, but he couldn't understand why. They had planned for everything, or so he thought. As the meeting dragged on, Richard's confidence began to wane. The board members were polite but distant, their responses lacking the enthusiasm he had expected. By the time the meeting concluded, Richard was shaking hands with smiles that felt empty, with promises to revisit the proposal that were nothing more than a polite dismissal. Samantha turned to him once they were alone in the hallway, her expression strained. "They weren't buying it," she said, frustration lacing her voice. "We need to regroup." Richard loosened his tie, his jaw clenched. "No, we presented exactly what they needed to see. They just don't have the vision to understand it yet." Samantha hesitated before nodding, but Richard could see the doubt in her eyes. He hated that doubt. As they stepped into the elevator, Richard pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages, expecting something, anything, from Eleanor. For years, she had been the first to check in after big meetings, offering support, insight, sometimes even gentle criticism. But there was nothing, and for the first time, that absence gnawed at him. Meanwhile, across town, Eleanor was seated at a sleek wooden desk in a private office suite, a stark contrast to the luxurious comfort of their penthouse. She glanced at the clock, knowing Richard's meeting would be wrapping up about now. A part of her felt a twinge of nostalgia for the days when she would have been by his side, analyzing every reaction, every subtle shift in the boardroom's mood. But today, she had something far more important in front of her. "Are you sure about this?" James Donovan asked, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "If you make this move, there's no going back." Eleanor smiled, tapping a pen against the sleek surface of the desk. I've never been more sure of anything, she said softly. Richard believes in brute force. I believe in strategy. James chuckled. That's what I've always liked about you, Eleanor. You see things no one else does. She glanced down at the documents in front of her, the ones outlining a deal that, if successful, would not only challenge Richard's proposal but overshadow it entirely. You underestimate how much you can learn by standing in the background, she murmured. And now it's time to step forward. James nodded, lifting his glass in a toast. To new beginnings, then. Eleanor clinked her glass lightly against his, the faint smile on her lips hiding the storm of emotions swirling within her. As the evening wore on, Richard sat alone in his study, nursing another drink, his thoughts swirling in frustration. The meeting hadn't gone the way he expected, and for the first time in years, he couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial, was slipping through his fingers. Eleanor's absence, once something he barely noticed, now felt like a void he didn't know how to fill. And as he stared at his phone, still void of any messages from her, an unsettling realization began to creep into his mind. Maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated the woman he had spent years dismissing. The sun hung low in the New York skyline, casting long shadows over Eleanor Thornton's desk as she carefully studied the documents spread before her. Every figure, every line of text, each small detail had been meticulously examined, revised, and perfected. For years, she had sat quietly in the background, watching Richard make his moves, observing how he commanded boardrooms with charisma and bravado. But Eleanor had always known that true power didn't come from noise. It came from understanding the landscape before anyone else did. And now, she was ready to take her place at the table, not as Richard's wife, but as his equal. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced down and saw James Donovan's name flash across the screen. Answering with a calm, composed tone, she said, "James." "Eleanor." His voice was warm, filled with admiration. "I just finished going through your proposal again. I have to say, it's impressive." A small smile touched her lips. "I'm glad you think so," she replied smoothly. "But we're not done yet. There's still more to fine-tune before I present it." James chuckled. "Eleanor, you've done your homework. This is exactly the kind of strategic, forward-thinking pitch they're looking for. I have no doubt it's going to make waves." She glanced at the clock, knowing Richard was probably still reeling from the board meeting earlier in the day. "Let's make sure it does," she said, her voice carrying a quiet determination. "I want it airtight." Hanging up, she exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her decision settle. For so long, Eleanor had allowed herself to be Richard's silent supporter, the one who worked tirelessly behind the scenes while he soaked in the limelight. But now, she was stepping forward with something bigger, something that had the potential to redefine the game entirely. Across town, Richard sat in his office, staring at the city beyond the glass walls, the lights flickering like distant reminders of his ambition. The meeting had not gone as planned. Despite Samantha's best efforts to salvage it, the board had left unconvinced, skeptical of his aggressive approach and the lack of substantial contingency planning. He drummed his fingers on the desk, frustration mounting. Eleanor's absence gnawed at him. She always had a way of seeing things from angles he missed, anticipating risks, calculating moves with a level of patience he had never possessed. He glanced at his phone, debating whether to call her, but his pride got the better of him. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, sighing heavily. Thinking too hard? Samantha's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching him with a playful smirk. Richard forced a smile. "Just going over what went wrong today." Samantha sauntered in, perching on the edge of his desk. "We'll bounce back. These things happen. Besides," she added with a wink, "you've still got me." Richard gave a short chuckle, but it felt hollow. He appreciated Samantha's confidence, but something about the board's reaction lingered in his mind. They had questioned his approach, his planning, things that Eleanor had always been an expert at. "I need to rethink our strategy," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "We're missing something." Samantha pursed her lips, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden shift in his tone. "Richard, don't tell me you're second-guessing yourself." That's not your style. He glanced at her, weighing his words carefully. It's not second-guessing, he said finally. It's making sure we're ahead of the game. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already a step behind. Meanwhile, Eleanor was sitting in a quiet, upscale restaurant, a glass of wine in hand, meeting with a small but powerful circle of investors. These were people Richard had dismissed in the past, individuals he believed didn't fit his vision of success. But Eleanor saw their potential, their patience, their eye for sustainable growth rather than flashy, short-term gains. I have no interest in playing the same game Richard does, she said, looking each investor in the eye. We're not here to chase temporary victories. This is about long-term value, about building something that lasts. The investors nodded, clearly intrigued. One of them, a distinguished-looking woman with salt and pepper hair, leaned forward. Eleanor, what you're proposing, it's bold. But it's also exactly what the market is shifting towards. Eleanor smiled knowingly. Exactly. She presented her vision with clarity and conviction, knowing that every word she spoke was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. She had spent years learning from Richard, but now she was creating something entirely her own, something that had the potential to eclipse everything he had built. Back at the penthouse, Richard arrived home late, his steps slow and heavy. The living room was dark, the silence thick and unsettling. He expected Eleanor to be there, as she always was, waiting with quiet support and gentle encouragement, but tonight, she was nowhere to be found. He loosened his tie, pouring himself a drink, and sat down on the couch, staring at the empty space across from him. It was the first time in a long while that he realized how much he had taken Eleanor's presence for granted. He pulled out his phone, staring at her number, but something stopped him from calling. What would he even say? That he needed her advice? That maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake pushing her aside? Instead, he set the phone down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The meeting had shaken him, but what unsettled him more was the growing realization that he might have underestimated Eleanor far more than he cared to admit. Eleanor walked into the penthouse hours later, the sound of her heels soft against the marble floors. Richard stirred from his thoughts, watching her closely. There was something different about her tonight, an air of quiet confidence that made him feel strangely off balance. "Where have you been?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. She set down her bag and glanced at him with a small, knowing smile. "Out." Richard studied her, feeling the shift in power, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Big night?" Eleanor simply shrugged. You could say that. He wanted to press her for details, but something told him he wouldn't like the answers. Instead, he watched as she disappeared into their bedroom, leaving him alone in the dimly lit room, staring at his untouched drink. For the first time, Richard felt something unfamiliar creeping into his gut. Uncertainty. Eleanor was no longer just the supportive wife in the background. She was something far more formidable now. Richard Thornton stepped into the penthouse, the familiar weight of the day pressing down on him harder than usual. The meeting hadn't gone as planned, and the lingering frustration sat heavy in his chest. The city lights twinkled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, but tonight, they felt distant, almost mocking. Dropping his briefcase on the entryway table, he loosened his tie and called out, "Eleanor?" His voice echoed through the vast, silent space. No response. He frowned. Eleanor was always home at this hour, usually waiting with a warm, albeit indifferent, smile and a glass of wine. But tonight, the place felt different. A nagging feeling gnawed at him, though he brushed it aside as exhaustion. Walking into the living room, he froze. There, sitting on the coffee table, was an elegant stack of neatly organized files, a sight far too familiar from his years of work. But these weren't his reports. With a slow, apprehensive step, he moved closer, his eyes narrowing at the embossed logo on the top page. Donovan Investments. His stomach twisted. Flipping through the pages, his hands grew tense. The documents outlined a groundbreaking deal, one that, if he wasn't mistaken, had the potential to reshape the market he had been chasing. Contracts, projections, partnerships, everything meticulously arranged with precision and vision that felt eerily familiar. His pulse quickened. Eleanor had been behind this. Before he could process it further, the sound of heels clicking against the marble floors drew his attention. Eleanor walked into the room, exuding the same quiet confidence she had always carried. But tonight, there was something else in her eyes, something Richard couldn't quite place. "I see you found the files," she said casually, pouring herself a glass of wine from the crystal decanter. Her voice was steady, not an ounce of guilt or hesitation in it. Richard turned to face her, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What is this?" he asked, holding up the documents. Eleanor took a sip of her wine and leaned against the counter, watching him with an unreadable expression. "It's a deal," she said simply. "One I closed today." His jaw tightened. "With Donovan? This is substantial." "Yes, it is." She set down her glass and crossed the room, taking a seat on the couch with a grace that only further unsettled him. "And it's a deal that you overlooked." Richard could feel the blood pounding in his ears. "You went behind my back?" Eleanor arched an eyebrow, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Behind your back?" she repeated. "Richard, I was never in front of you to begin with." "You made sure of that." His grip on the papers tightened. The realization was sinking in, but he refused to acknowledge it just yet. "This isn't your world, Eleanor," he said, his tone edged with irritation. "You don't understand the complexities of—" "Oh, but I do," she interrupted smoothly, folding her hands in her lap. "I've been watching you for years, Richard, studying your moves, learning your mistakes. And while you were busy chasing the next big thing, I was preparing for something much bigger." He stared at her, struggling to process the shift in dynamic that had blindsided him. Eleanor, the woman who had always been content to stay in the background, to quietly support him without question, had orchestrated something monumental without him even noticing. "I don't understand," he muttered, sinking into the armchair across from her. "Why would you do this?" Eleanor's expression softened just slightly, but the steel in her gaze remained. "Because I was tired of being underestimated," she said. "Tired of being overlooked. Tired of waiting for you to see me as more than just the woman who makes sure your life runs smoothly." Richard opened his mouth to argue, to refute, to somehow take back control of the conversation. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "You thought I couldn't handle your world," she continued, her voice calm but firm. "But what you don't realize is that I've been handling it all along. Quietly, carefully. And now, I'm done waiting for permission." The silence between them was thick, stretching across the space like an invisible chasm. Richard, for the first time in a long time, was at a loss for words. Eleanor stood, brushing imaginary dust from her dress. "I closed the biggest deal of your career today, Richard," she said, walking past him toward the hallway. "And I did it without you." As she disappeared into their bedroom, Richard remained seated, staring at the papers in his hands. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like an anchor. He had spent so much time believing Eleanor didn't belong in his world that he had never considered the possibility that she might surpass him in it. He looked around the penthouse, the lavish decor, the reminders of his success, and for the first time, it all felt strangely hollow. Richard's gaze drifted back to the contract in his hands, his mind racing. Eleanor Thornton. Her signature was crisp and deliberate at the bottom of the deal, a final statement that she wasn't just his wife. She was his competitor now, and deep down, Richard couldn't decide if he was more furious or impressed. The night stretched on, but Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the evening's revelations over and over. Eleanor had outmaneuvered him in a way he never thought possible. How had he missed it? How had he not seen the signs? Was he losing his edge? Or worse, had he ever really had it when Eleanor had been quietly playing her own game all along? Hours later, Eleanor stirred beside him, her breathing slow and even, as if she hadn't just upended his entire world. Richard turned his head, watching her in the dim light of the bedroom. He wondered if he had truly ever known her at all. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Thornton felt something unfamiliar gnawing at him. Doubt. Richard Thornton sat in his office, staring out at the sprawling city skyline, his mind heavy with the weight of Eleanor's unexpected triumph. The documents she had left on the coffee table were now spread out before him, their contents scrutinized over and over, as if searching for a loophole, a flaw, anything that would explain how he had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered. The realization gnawed at him like a relentless ache. Eleanor had not only stepped into his world, but she had done so effortlessly, with a level of precision and foresight that left him reeling. The woman he had dismissed, replaced, and overlooked had just secured the biggest deal of his career. Without him, he exhaled sharply, his fingers drumming against the mahogany desk. The meeting with the board hadn't been a disaster, but it had lacked the momentum he had expected. And now he knew why. Eleanor had been moving pieces behind the scenes, while he had been too preoccupied with his own self-importance to notice. His phone buzzed. He glanced down, expecting a message from Samantha, but instead, it was from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it. "I hope you're starting to see things clearly now. I'll be in touch soon." No signature, but he didn't need one. Eleanor's message was clear in more ways than one. Richard leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. His thoughts drifted back to when they first met, how Eleanor had always been the grounded one, the voice of reason when his ambitions threatened to spiral out of control. She had never sought the spotlight, preferring to work from the shadows, balancing his impulses with her quiet wisdom. And now, she had proven that she could not only keep up but surpass him in ways he never imagined. His ego stung, but beneath it, there was something else, a flicker of admiration. "Mr. Thornton?" Samantha's voice pierced through his thoughts as she entered the office, her heels clicking against the marble floors. She held a clipboard in one hand and a look of barely concealed concern on her face. "The team is asking for updates on the acquisition plan. They want to know if we're still moving forward." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaustion settling in. "We need to reassess," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "We're missing something crucial." Samantha frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "You mean Eleanor?" He looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" Samantha shrugged, feigning nonchalance, but her expression betrayed her curiosity. "Come on, Richard. It's obvious. Eleanor's move has everyone talking. They're wondering how much she knew, how long she's been planning this." Richard's jaw tightened. "She didn't just stumble into this, Samantha. She's been watching, waiting." Samantha perched on the edge of his desk, crossing her legs. "So, what's your next move? You're not just going to let her outshine you, are you?" He clenched his fists, staring at the skyline once more. "No," he said, more to himself than to her. "I need to understand how she did this. What I missed." Samantha leaned closer, her tone lowering. "Richard, if I may." "You got too comfortable." Her words stung because they were true. Eleanor had been there all along, quietly gathering knowledge, while he had been too focused on the future to see the present. Later that evening, Richard found himself standing outside their penthouse, staring at the door as if it held the answers he so desperately sought. Inside, the world he had built with Eleanor felt foreign, distant. He walked in to find her sitting by the fireplace, a book in her lap and a glass of wine on the side table. She looked up, meeting his gaze with a composed expression that only further unsettled him. "Working late?" she asked, turning a page without breaking eye contact. Richard loosened his tie, stepping further into the room. "You could say that," he replied, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Seems like you've been busy too." Eleanor's lips curved slightly, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. He sat across from her, his eyes scanning her face for any trace of the woman he thought he knew. "Why didn't you tell me?" She set the book down gently. "Tell you what, Richard? That you were working on something this big. That you were planning behind my back." Eleanor leaned back into her chair, her gaze steady. "Because, Richard, you never asked. And, honestly, would you have listened if I had?" He opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Because she was right. He had spent so long thinking of Eleanor as his supporting act that he never considered she might have ambitions of her own. All these years, he murmured, shaking his head. "You were just waiting?" She took a slow sip of her wine before replying. Not waiting, Richard. Preparing. Silence hung between them, thick with unspoken words. Richard felt something he hadn't in a long time. Uncertainty. He prided himself on being the man with the answers, the solutions, but now he was sitting across from someone who had outplayed him without him even realizing it. "So, what now?" he finally asked. Eleanor studied him for a long moment before answering. "That depends on you." Richard leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice softer than usual. "Eleanor, I don't know if I can fix this." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not about fixing, Richard. It's about recognizing what's in front of you before it's too late." For the first time, he saw her not as the woman he had grown accustomed to, but as someone entirely new, someone who had the power to stand on her own. And it terrified him. As the night stretched on, Richard sat alone in the dimly lit room, Eleanor's words echoing in his head. He had always believed that success meant having control, but perhaps he had misunderstood what true strength looked like all along. And in that quiet moment, for the first time in his life, Richard Thornton felt the stirrings of something he had long ignored: regret. Richard Thornton stood in his office, staring at the city skyline through the large glass windows. The familiar view that once brought him a sense of control now felt distant, almost indifferent to his turmoil. The city thrived with or without him, and that realization gnawed at him in a way he wasn't prepared to admit. He ran a hand through his hair, loosening his tie, feeling the weight of the past week pressing down like a suffocating fog. Eleanor's unexpected victory had shaken him to his core. For years, he had assumed she was content in the background, happy to play the supportive wife while he made all the big decisions. But now, he was starting to see just how much he had underestimated her. She wasn't just playing along. She had been observing, calculating, and waiting for her moment. And when that moment came, she didn't hesitate. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. Samantha's name flashed on the screen. With a sigh, he picked it up. "We need to talk," Samantha said, her tone sharp and businesslike. "I know," Richard replied, rubbing his temple. "Come by in an hour." An hour later, Samantha strode into his office, her usual confidence slightly frayed around the edges. She placed a folder on his desk and crossed her arms. "Richard, this situation with Eleanor, it's not going away. People are talking. Investors are questioning your leadership," Richard scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "So, what? They think I've lost my edge because Eleanor closed one deal?" Samantha sighed. "It's not just about the deal, Richard. It's about perception. You built your empire on being the guy who always has control, who's always 10 steps ahead. But now, it looks like you didn't even see this coming." He bristled at her words, but knew she wasn't wrong. The cracks in his carefully constructed image were starting to show, and he hated it. He stared at the folder she had placed on his desk. "What's this?" "A breakdown of Eleanor's new deal," Samantha said, her voice edged with frustration. "I had my team dig into it. It's airtight, Richard." She knew exactly what she was doing. Richard flipped through the pages, scanning the figures, the projections, the strategy. It was undeniably brilliant. Steady growth, minimized risks, and long-term sustainability. It was everything his aggressive approach wasn't. Samantha sat down, her gaze piercing. "We need to counter this, and fast. If we let this sit, she's going to keep gaining ground." Richard closed the folder, exhaling slowly. "We?" he repeated, his voice quieter. "Samantha, I need to figure out what's next. This isn't just business. This is personal." Samantha's eyes narrowed. "Richard, business is always personal." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in a while, and realized something unsettling. Samantha was all strategy, all calculation. She was good at what she did, but she didn't understand Eleanor. Not the way he should have. "I need to talk to her," he said finally, pushing his chair back and standing. Samantha rolled her eyes. "And say what? Congratulations on outsmarting me?" "Richard, you need to focus on moving forward, not looking back." But Richard wasn't so sure anymore. Moving forward had always been his default setting, but now, for the first time, he found himself wanting to understand what he had left behind. That evening, Richard arrived home earlier than usual. Eleanor was in the living room, her laptop open, but she didn't look up when he walked in. The room was filled with the soft hum of classical music, a stark contrast to the tension between them. He cleared his throat. "We need to talk." Eleanor glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. "About what?" Richard hesitated, then sat across from her. "About everything. The deal, us, where we're going." She closed her laptop, setting it aside with deliberate slowness. "Richard, you've never been interested in US unless it affected your business. What's changed?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself more than anything. "Maybe I should have been." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then leaned back against the couch, crossing her legs. "You always assumed I was just along for the ride, that I didn't have ambitions of my own." Richard nodded, his throat tightening. "I did, and I was wrong." Her lips twitched into a small smile, but it wasn't one of victory. It was one of understanding. "Richard, I didn't do this to hurt you," she said softly. "I did it because I needed to prove to myself that I could." He looked away, staring at the floor. "And now that you have?" Eleanor sighed. "Now I have options." That statement hit him harder than he expected. He had always assumed Eleanor would be there, a constant in his life. But now, she had choices, ones that didn't necessarily include him. "What do you want, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. She looked at him with a gaze that was both tender and resolute. "I want to be seen, to be valued, and not just as your wife, but as someone capable of standing on my own." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing her words. For the first time, he saw Eleanor not as the woman in his shadow, but as someone who had been standing beside him all along, waiting for him to notice. "I see you now," he said, the words tasting unfamiliar yet oddly right. Eleanor smiled, and for a brief moment, Richard felt a flicker of hope. But whether that hope would be enough to bridge the gap between them remained to be seen. As the evening stretched on, they sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The turning point had come, but where it would lead was still uncertain. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the penthouse, casting elongated shadows across the polished marble floor. Richard Thornton sat at the dining table, his fingers loosely wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. He stared into the dark liquid, lost in thoughts that gnawed at him like an old wound reopened. The night before had been a revelation, one that left him feeling hollow and unsteady. He had always believed himself to be in control of his life, his career, his marriage. But Eleanor's quiet triumph had shattered that illusion with brutal precision. She had done what he never imagined she could. She had built something without him. Worse, she had thrived without him. The soft shuffle of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Eleanor entered the room, dressed in a crisp navy blazer and a matching skirt that hugged her frame with effortless elegance. Her hair was styled in a way that spoke of quiet confidence, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air as she moved past him to the counter. Without a word, she poured herself a cup of tea, her movements precise and deliberate. Richard watched her, studying the way she carried herself. There was a newfound sense of purpose in every step, in every glance, and it terrified him. "Busy day?" he asked, attempting a casual tone that fell flat. Eleanor met his gaze over the rim of her teacup, her eyes cool and unreadable. "Productive," she corrected with a faint smile, as if the distinction was necessary. He exhaled, setting his coffee down with a soft clink. "You're meeting Donovan today?" She nodded, taking a slow sip. "Yes. We're finalizing the second phase of the deal." Richard's stomach twisted. The second phase. It meant that her momentum was building, that she was moving forward without hesitation. He searched for the right words, something that wouldn't sound desperate, something that would anchor him back into relevance in her world. "Eleanor, I didn't see this coming." She arched a brow, setting her cup down with a quiet elegance that belied the weight of his words. "Didn't you?" Her voice was calm but pointed. "Or did you just not want to?" He swallowed hard. "I didn't think you. I never thought you wanted to be involved like this." Eleanor let out a soft laugh, though there was little humor in it. "Richard, I've always been involved. I was just Convenient for you to overlook. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. That's not fair. Eleanor's expression remained composed, but her eyes softened just slightly. Isn't it? A heavy silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken truths and years of quiet resignation. Richard had always prided himself on being the man with the answers, the visionary. But now, faced with the reality of Eleanor's independence, he realized how much he had missed. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Eleanor sighed, studying him with a mix of sadness and something else, acceptance. Richard, this isn't about losing or winning, she said gently. It's about recognizing that I have my own path now, and I can't keep waiting for you to catch up. His throat tightened. Then let me be part of it. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs gracefully. I don't know if that's possible anymore, she admitted. You see, for years, I waited for you to see me as your equal. But now that I've stepped forward, I don't know if I can go back to being what I was before. Richard looked away, guilt washing over him in waves. He had spent so much time building his empire that he had failed to see the foundation beneath it, Eleanor. And now, she was building something of her own, something that didn't revolve around him. I can change, he said, his voice raw with sincerity. Eleanor smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that told him she had already considered that possibility and moved past it. Some things can't be undone, Richard. He nodded slowly, the realization settling in like a lead weight in his chest. So, what now? Eleanor stood, adjusting her blazer with a sense of finality. Now, I move forward. And you figure out what that means for you. He watched as she gathered her things, his heart pounding in his chest. Eleanor, he said, desperation creeping into his tone. I want to support you. She paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression that held equal parts kindness and resolve. Then support me by letting me grow. And with that, she walked out, leaving Richard sitting alone in the vast, empty penthouse. Later that afternoon, Richard found himself sitting in his office, staring at the bustling city below. The world outside continued to move, unaffected by his internal turmoil. He thought about calling Samantha, about rallying his team to find a way to reclaim the ground he had lost. But something held him back. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos. Images of him and Eleanor, moments of laughter and love from years gone by. He lingered on a photo from their anniversary trip to Paris, a time when their relationship had been a partnership rather than a competition. He exhaled slowly and made a decision. He didn't want to fight Eleanor. He wanted to understand her. Grabbing his coat, he left the office without a word, heading toward Eleanor's new office building. He stood outside for a long moment, watching her through the glass as she spoke animatedly with a group of investors. She looked radiant, confident, in control, and completely at ease in this new role she had carved out for herself. For the first time in years, he saw her clearly, and for the first time, he wondered if it was too late to truly be part of her world. Richard turned away, realizing that this wasn't about reclaiming what he had lost. It was about proving that he could be more than just the man who once stood at the top. And maybe, just maybe, he could learn to support her in a way he never had before. The evening air was thick with the scent of rain as Richard Thornton stood on the balcony of his penthouse, staring out over the city he once thought he had conquered. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, each building a testament to ambition and power, yet tonight, it felt strangely distant, like something he no longer recognized. He gripped the cool steel railing, his knuckles whitening as he wrestled with the swirling thoughts that had plagued him for days. It had been a week since Eleanor had walked out of the penthouse with that air of quiet confidence that haunted him in the dead of night. A week since she had left him staring after her, his world crumbling in ways he never anticipated. And now, sitting alone in their once shared space, the silence was deafening. He glanced down at his phone, the screen still displaying her message from earlier that day. I think we both know this is for the best. For the best. The words echoed in his head, twisting and turning until they felt like a cruel joke. He had spent years believing that their life together, his life, was built on solid ground. but now it felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The sound of the door opening pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, half expecting to see Eleanor standing there, but instead, it was Samantha, her expression carefully neutral as she stepped inside. She looked at him for a moment, her gaze assessing. "You missed the meeting today," she said, closing the door behind her. Richard sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know. I needed some time." Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Richard, that's not like you. Investors are getting nervous. They're asking questions, and I don't have answers." He stared at her, his jaw tightening. "Maybe I don't have answers either." Samantha blinked, caught off guard by the admission. "That's not the Richard Thornton I know." A bitter smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe you never really knew me." She crossed the room, standing by the large marble coffee table where stacks of reports and business proposals lay untouched. "Eleanor's deal with Donovan," she said, tapping the folder with a manicured finger. "It's shaking things up. People are talking. They're saying she's playing the long game, and we're scrambling to keep up." Richard exhaled slowly, sinking into the leather armchair. "Because she is," he admitted, staring at the ceiling. "She's always been patient, calculated. I just never gave her the credit she deserved." Samantha folded her arms, studying him carefully. "So, what's the plan, Richard? Are you going to fight back, or let her win?" Richard sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's not about winning anymore, Sam." He paused, running a hand over his face. "Maybe it never was." Samantha frowned. "Richard, we built this company on your drive, your vision. You don't get to second-guess yourself now." He looked up at her, and for the first time, there was something raw in his eyes, something vulnerable. "What if I've been driving in the wrong direction?" The words hung heavy in the air, and Samantha had no response. After a long pause, she straightened her posture. "You've got one chance to fix this," she said quietly. "If you want to take it." Richard watched her leave, the sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor fading into the silence that followed. He glanced down at the folder on the table, Eleanor's name staring back at him from the neatly typed cover page. His fingers traced the edges of the paper, a mix of admiration and regret swirling inside him. The next morning, Richard found himself sitting outside a small cafe in the financial district, his fingers tapping anxiously against his coffee cup. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, her stride purposeful and her expression unreadable as she took the seat across from him. "You look good," he said awkwardly, breaking the silence. Eleanor gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I am good, Richard." She stirred her tea slowly, watching him with quiet curiosity. "Why did you ask me to meet you?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I wanted to talk. About us. About everything." She raised an eyebrow. "Everything?" He nodded, feeling the weight of the words he was about to say. "I've been thinking a lot, Eleanor. About how I treated you. How I took you for granted." Eleanor's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "I always thought I was the one holding everything together," he continued. "But the truth is you were. And I didn't see it." He looked down at his hands. "And I'm sorry for that." Eleanor set her cup down gently. "Richard, I appreciate that," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But apologies don't change what's already happened." "I know," he said quickly. "I don't expect anything. I just want you to know that I understand now." Eleanor studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I hope you do," she said softly. "Because I've changed, Richard. I'm not the same woman who waited in the background for you to notice me." Richard felt a pang in his chest. "I know," he admitted. "And I think that's what scares me the most." She smiled, this time with a hint of sadness. "You'll be okay, Richard. You always land on your feet." He laughed dryly. "Maybe. But for once, I wish I'd landed with you." Eleanor reached across the table, placing her hand over his for a brief moment before pulling away. "Take care of yourself, Richard." He watched her go, feeling a strange sense of closure that he hadn't expected. She had moved on, not out of spite, not out of anger, but because she had found herself in ways he never allowed her to before. And now, It was his turn to figure out who he was without her. Back at the office, Richard stood in front of the large floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city pulse with life below. He knew he had choices to make, choices that would determine the future of his business and his own identity. For so long, he had believed that power and control were the ultimate goals. But Eleanor had taught him something far more valuable. Growth wasn't about dominance. It was about understanding. And for the first time, Richard was ready to learn. The city pulsed with life beneath Richard Thornton's penthouse, the streets bustling with the energy of people chasing their ambitions, ambitions that once mirrored his own. He stood by the expansive window, staring out at the horizon, his reflection ghosting over the glass like a man caught between two worlds. His empire still stood, yet it felt as if the ground beneath it had shifted irreversibly. Eleanor was gone, not just physically, but from his orbit entirely. She had stepped out from behind his shadow and into a light of her own, and Richard was left grappling with the realization that he had been the architect of his own downfall. He turned away from the view, walking slowly to his desk where a pile of reports lay untouched. They were filled with numbers, projections, and strategy suggestions from his team, all attempts to counter Eleanor's meteoric rise in the business world. Each proposal felt like a bandage over a wound too deep to heal. The truth was, no spreadsheet could calculate what he had lost. His phone buzzed, and for a fleeting moment, he hoped it was Eleanor. But the name on the screen made him sigh. "Samantha, we need to act, Richard." Her voice came through sharp and insistent when he picked up. "Eleanor is closing in on our territory, and if we don't counter her strategy soon, we're going to be left in the dust." Richard rubbed his temples. "I know, Sam." Samantha's frustration was palpable. "Then why are you just sitting there? We have the resources, the influence. We can outmaneuver her." Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting back to the empty side of the room where Eleanor's presence once softened the edges of his life. "It's not just about business anymore." Samantha scoffed. "You're being sentimental. This is war, Richard." A bitter smile touched his lips. Maybe that's the problem. For so long, he had seen life through the lens of conquest and victory, but Eleanor had played a different game, one of patience, strategy, and integrity. And she had won, not by crushing him, but by proving she never needed him in the first place. Later that afternoon, Richard found himself outside Eleanor's new office building. It was an impressive structure, sleek, modern, and undeniably hers. He had no real reason to be there, but something inside him needed to see it with his own eyes, to understand what she had built. As he lingered across the street, Eleanor stepped outside, walking with her usual grace and confidence. She was on the phone, deep in conversation, but even from a distance, Richard could see the satisfaction in her expression. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Richard felt something stir deep within him. Pride, regret, admiration, and perhaps the faintest glimmer of longing. Eleanor gave him a polite nod before stepping into a waiting car, leaving him standing alone on the sidewalk. She had moved on, and it was time he did too. That evening, back at his penthouse, Richard sat with a glass of whiskey, staring down at the deal Eleanor had closed, the one that had eclipsed anything he had ever done. It wasn't just the numbers that impressed him. It was the way she had approached it, with patience, with grace, with the kind of insight he had always dismissed as too soft, too careful. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over her name in his contacts. After a long pause, he pressed call. Eleanor answered after 2 rings. "Richard," she said, her voice steady but distant. I wanted to say congratulations," he said, swirling his drink absent-mindedly. "You did good." There was a brief pause, then a soft chuckle. "Thank you, Richard. That means a lot." He hesitated before speaking again. "I was wrong about you." "I know," she replied simply, without bitterness. Richard smiled to himself. "So, what now?" Eleanor's voice softened. "Now, I keep moving forward. And I hope you do too." He nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Take care, Eleanor." "You too, Richard." As he ended the call, he felt something shift inside him, an acceptance he hadn't been ready for before. The sweetest revenge, he realized, wasn't in proving himself better than Eleanor. It was in finally accepting that she had outgrown him, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. With a deep breath, he raised his glass in a silent toast, to Eleanor, to himself, and to whatever came next. The game was over. It was time to start again,